My next guest is Dr. Robert Malone, a scientist, author and public speaker, a very familiar face and name for those who've been following the story of the COVID pandemic from the beginning, and in particular those listening out for voices that ran counter to the official narrative. Welcome, Dr. Robert Malone.
Thank you, Neil. It's such a pleasure to see you again. I'm glad you're doing well, and I'm glad you're still broadcasting from GB News.
I do my best, Robert. It feels to me, under the terms of this treaty, that we're moving inexorably towards a one-size-fits-all, one-government solution being sought to a multivariant problem. How do you feel about that direction of travel?
So the basic logic is that of a centralized global command economy. I'm choosing words that don't have a lot of burdens around them in terms of alternate meaning. In terms of your conversational moment with my friend Kat, you asked about the potential enforcement arm. What I've heard proposed is that the World Trade Organization would function as that enforcement arm for the World Health Organization. So the potential enforcement, should a nation state not comply with the mandates from Mr. Tedros, and it is, let us be clear, Mr. Tedros can declare a public health emergency for any reason, and he can declare whatever measures he might deem appropriate. So the absence of specific measures in the 32-page document is irrelevant. What it would grant is the ability to implement whatever measures should be deemed appropriate. Would Mr. Tedros, you might ask yourself, act in an arbitrary and capricious manner? I suggest that the 9-6 vote against declaring a global health emergency for the recent monkeypox outbreak, which was overruled by Mr. Tedros as a tie, which he then personally broke and declared that it was such a global emergency, provides one a window into the decision-making process, which I would characterize as arbitrary and capricious, but that's my personal opinion. My opinion is that we are in very dangerous territory. There is this set of documents which are not a conspiracy theory having to do with the global reset, the desire to advance a fourth industrial revolution, the desire to advance a transhumanism agenda. And unfortunately, the inconvenient truth is that this issue of a reset, great reset, was first discussed in public, to the best of my knowledge, by your recently coronated king, not by the leadership of the World Economic Forum. Please let's also recall that the World Economic Forum has some sort of surreptitious treaty with the United Nations, and apparently through that with the World Health Organization, and is providing significant funding, which funding is not disclosed to the public. So we don't really know what is going on behind the scenes, what funds transfers are occurring, what the channels of influence are. We do know these documents and artifacts that we can find, such as Klaus Schwab's book, The Great Reset, and The Great Narrative. Those are publicly available. We do have the statements from your new. Do believe that we are in a situation in which, for instance, the British Nudge Unit and your 77th Brigade have been willing to deploy psychological operations on their citizenry. This is technology designed for offshore combat, for PSYOPs or PSYWAR combat. They've deployed it on your population by their own statements. And I argue that in an environment in which a government, even if it's only for a 4-year period, feels that it's acceptable to deploy these advanced psychological operations technologies on their citizens, the concept of sovereignty is obsolete. It's an anachronism.
Dr. Malone, listening to that, how is a person like myself, who's caught in the middle of all this, listening to both sides, to decide whether or not, as you say, we're in real danger of loss of sovereignty, while on the other hand, there are other strong voices and strong opinions saying it's non-binding and nation states will always have the final say. How is someone like me to discern the truth?
So the earlier version of the draft absolutely indicated that it was binding. This is now a revised version, consequent largely to objections from the African and Latin American states, particularly Brazil. There have been these revisions. As correctly noted, these are draft documents currently in negotiation. Yeah. What we have seen is a chronic pattern of incrementalism. So one sees these types of language, and you'll notice that the language that's been inserted now, that differs from the prior draft of the IHR, which the gentleman may or may not have referred to previously or reviewed. What we see is a softening of language in a very non-specific fashion. So we don't see specific statements that there will not be breaches of sovereignty, but rather we see indications of intent. After the last 3 years, I personally, and I think many colleagues, have become rather wary of soft statements of intent or good intent. We've come to the point where we believe that these types of freedoms, these types of international treaties and agreements need to be stated very, very explicitly, lest they be interpreted in the context of some future event as being more permissive or promiscuous for more authoritarian responses than we may have thought was their intention originally. In other words, I mistrust statements that are soft and squishy. I want to see clear, tangible statements explicitly, for instance, that the World Health Organization does not have the authority to impose any restrictions on, for instance, the British people, any mandates for what pharmaceuticals or medical interventions they shall take. There is no regulation allowing the bypassing of your public health authority and its oversight. This is the type of language I want to see, is clear and explicit barriers to overreach from the World Health Organization, such as we have seen with lockdowns, masking, and so many other things that have done such deep damage to the economics and the populace of your great country.
Dr. Malone, finally, do you feel that you're overturning the apathy that has been out there? You know, the people don't seem, general populations don't seem to be paying too much attention to this. Do you see any shift of traction?
That, to be honest, that's very difficult to answer because I acknowledge that I am in a bubble. For instance, when we testified for the third International COVID Summit in Brussels earlier this week, we're surrounded by MPs and others, interested parties, alternative media, that is all of a similar frame of mind to those of us that were speaking. The dominant party in Romania is also of that opinion, but that is not a universal opinion. And is there a shift? It appears that there has been a major political shift in Australia. It appears that the changes in COVID policy in Switzerland and the new data about what the effects of the various policies have been in Sweden compared to the rest of Europe suggests that there is increasing momentum. My sense is there's much more momentum in the European continent. As was recently noted, the polling in the UK suggested that if lockdown was a party, it would win going away. And so I really can't infer about the population in Great Britain. I do sense that there is some shift in momentum, but I don't want to become overly enthusiastic prematurely.
It's so important that you raise this subject and that you keep pushing this in front of us for our consideration. I've run out of time again. Dr. Robert Malone, thank you so much for your time.